What's up, buddy?
Afternoon.
Hey, TJ.
How you doing?
So we're just going to take a moment to see if we get one more member, and we have one more member.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Tom.
Hey, Greg. Hi, guys.
So,
So I know John McCarthy had indicated he may have a conflict with today. And I think Tessa Brown also said that she might have to leave early. But I think what we'll do is we'll get rolling and then let people file in as they come in. So I'm going to do a quick screen share just of the agenda. Everybody can see that okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So Rick, I'll take the honors of doing the reading, and then you can do a roll call of membership.
Very
So
good.
this is the Harbor Plan Committee meeting of May 12th. It's just after 3 o'clock. Consistent with the governor's order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law and banning gatherings of more than 10 people, although that's maybe a little bit more. We've changed that a little bit to say that we're still not having public gatherings. This meeting will be conducted by remote participation to the greatest extent possible. The public may not physically attend this meeting, but every effort will be made to allow the public to view and listen to the meeting in real time. In the event that a live transmission proves unworkable for any reason, an audio or video recording transcript or other comprehensive record of the meeting will be made available on the city's website as soon as possible. And also noting that this meeting is being recorded. So if you want to do a roll call of membership, or I can do the roll call of membership.
Okay. Okay, great.
Chairman Noonan,
Yes.
Member Balfe,
Present.
Member Gigaloni,
Present.
Member Gross,
here,
Member Call,
Here.
and that looks like what we have for membership.
Greg,
So go ahead.
Greg, can you send out the agenda in a separate email?
Yes, I could do that. It's a fairly tight agenda, but I can
Yeah,
certainly,
it
I'll
wasn't
circulate that as
scrolling
well.
up and down.
Okay. So
Okay.
essentially what we are here for this afternoon is to have an introduction of the selected consulting team, and just to update the public as well in terms of the process. We did put an RFP out for consulting services way back, I think towards the end of February. Went through a period of it being available, held a pre-bid conference with folks that might bid on the process for that contract. And we had two very strong teams respond that are made up of really a multidisciplinary team to cover all of the aspects that are needed for fulfilling the scope. And through a combination of interview, review of the response to proposals, as well as referencing, which I will say all of the consultants involved on both of the teams were highly recommended. So we did definitely receive the response that we were looking for, and we have selected a team that's going to be led up by Util and Associates, and several of the members are here this afternoon. And so without any further introduction, I'll allow members of the team to introduce themselves, as they also provide a presentation as to the scope that they are going to accomplish, the time frame, milestones associated with the project, and when to anticipate meetings of the membership, as well as public engagement strategies around this effort. So I can turn it over to Matt Little from Util if you want to take the floor.
Sure. I'm wondering if Taskina from Util, if you want to control the show.
I think Will is going to do that today.
Okay, Will's going to do it.
Yeah, he'll be sharing the screen.
So Will will start the show, and I'll introduce our broad team structure more fully, but maybe we just introduce ourselves individually. There's 3 of us here from UTL plus Jamie Fay from 4 Point Associates / Tetra Tech. My name is Matthew Littell. I'm a principal at UTL. I work primarily in urban design and planning, as well as some multifamily housing. I've worked on several municipal harbor plans. We're currently working in Salem. We completed Lynn and East Boston fairly recently, among others. I will talk a little bit more about our team, but maybe I'll give each team member a chance to introduce themselves. Will, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Will Cohen. I'm an urban planner at UTL. I worked on the previous harbor planning effort run by Nina Grit Partners when we were subconsultants to them. I worked on a range of harbor plans, citywide plans, and district plans throughout the Commonwealth and New England for a while now.
Hi,
And I'll
everyone.
give it to Tiskina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tiskina Turing. I'm an urban planner and urban designer with UTL. I've worked closely with both Matthew and Will on a variety of projects throughout New England, including city planning projects, district plans, and neighborhood plans. And for this particular effort, I'll be sort of the day-to-day project manager of the process, as well as coordinating team efforts and public engagement activities.
And Jamie.
Okay, yeah, I'm Jamie Fay, president of 4 Point Associates. We're planners and environmental consultants located in Boston. We have been very actively involved in municipal harbor plans, including the existing version of the Salem Harbor Plan, New Bedford Harbor Plan, City of Everett Harbor Plan, and various iterations of the Boston Harbor Plans. We are very actively involved in waterfront development all over the Commonwealth, all kinds of different projects, from shipyards to tank farms to hotels and waterfront restaurants and residential developments, all types in all areas. We are very actively involved in a number of projects in designated port areas, very familiar with those regulations. We were responsible for permitting the Encore Boston Harbor Resort in Everett. My experience in Gloucester goes back probably 40 years. Actually was involved in the establishment of the Gloucester Redevelopment Authority, working for Mayor Alper at the time as a consultant, and facilitated, permitted, and approved, funded the Head of the Harbor project, and helped to attract private developers to those parcels for redevelopment. Also was very actively involved in the State Fish Pier, and have been involved on and off in other parts of the harbor, including the Rocky Neck Railways and other areas. So hoping to bring some perspective on that part of waterfront development to the team. And Jason is here, I believe, right, Jason?
Yes. Yeah. How are you? Hi, Jason
Excellent.
Hollering with Tetra Tech. So work with Jamie, but work with our part of the team that's more on the infrastructure and engineering side. And so we'll be supporting the team on the municipal harbor plan update, and that will include some of the utilities, anything to really support some of the economic development strategy, but utilities, municipal infrastructure, some of the transportation, any of those areas that could potentially impact the development strategy. And then also some of the coastal resilience elements and flooding, and then also some of the coastal infrastructure around some of the waterfront access, the docks, bulkheads, kind of some of those assessments and how that fits into that broader strategy. So looking forward to working with the team.
Okay, thank you, Jason. What you're seeing is a little bit of a collaboration graphic here of all the various disciplines that we've brought to this. The city has asked for some very specific analyses prior to even getting into the municipal harbor planning process proper. And that includes both economic analysis as well as analysis of resilience and flood protection. I don't need to reintroduce Tetra Tech and 4 Point Associates, Jamie and Jason did a very good job of that. But they will be working very closely with Nasser Brahim of the Woods Hole Group. They will be looking at some of the potential impacts of flooding and hope to build on the outcome of a CZM study that's currently taking place to look at impacts of sea level rise and potential mitigation strategies. Kevin Hively from Ninegret Partners will be doing the bulk of the economic analysis to understand the market, the current market, the trends, what's happened to the economy in Gloucester since the last municipal harbor plan. Kevin worked, in fact, led the last municipal harbor plan and is extremely familiar with the economy of the city and very familiar in general with industrial economies, particularly waterfront industrial economies. So he will be doing his work primarily during the first phases of the project. And then we're also joined in maybe more of an advisory capacity by Dave Andrews of Brown, Richardson and Rowe. They are one of the premier landscape firms in the Commonwealth. We are working with them on this project because we collaborated very closely on the Lynn Municipal Harbor Plan, and they bring a real working understanding of Chapter 91 regulation as it pertains to open space. So anyone missing from our group today will be appearing as needed, depending on the phase of the project as we move forward.
Matt, if I could just interject for 1 second, I just wanted to also recognize just on the header there, client team. So several community development staff working on this, myself, Jill Cahill, the community development director, who's not on the call today, as well as Gemma Wilkins, who's the staff planner in my office. And I also wanted to recognize that we also are looking for other staff support, including the harbor master, TJ Shimataro is on the call as well. And the mayor is also on the call, as well as Krista Carranza from the mayor's administration. So just wanted to, that we'll definitely be bringing in other city staff as needed for, a very important project. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Before Will proceeds to get into a little bit more detail about the scope and the schedule, I just want to give an overview of, I think, where we're going to get today. It's really just a chance to introduce ourselves, to introduce you to the scope as we've defined it and refined it a little bit, to talk a little bit about the schedule and some of the factors that come into play, and then perhaps conclude with a few questions and issues that we think will be relevant to this planning process moving forward, and hope that might generate some good initial discussion. Okay, I think I'm handing it off to Will now.
All right, so thank you very much. So I guess I just want to start by reminding us all of the area that we're talking about. Right, there's a distinction between, well, there's a number of different jurisdictional lines that are worth remembering, which we'll be thinking about for the purpose of this harbor plan. There's the designated port area thing codified by statute that has all the restrictions that come with it. Separately, there's the Chapter 91 jurisdiction line, which is based on the historic high water line, where things inland of that, for the most part, depending on the exact characterization, have another set of restrictions applied to them. And there's, an interesting relationship between what is in the DPA versus out of the DPA versus in Chapter 91 versus out of Chapter 91 in terms of what exactly you can do, and all the nuances there matter a great deal. And then there's actually sort of the harbor planning area, and that is a little bit more malleable, but I would say generally speaking, where all the teeth lie is really where DPA and Chapter 91 jurisdiction apply, because besides that, land is really regulated as any other land within the city of Gloucester. City of Gloucester. in terms of project scoping, Matthew did a really good job of talking through all the different disciplines, but it's worth noting that for the purpose of this plan, the places of the different disciplines fall at different times and with different levels of magnitude. You can see here at the very top left, economic strategy. That encompasses more than pure economic development, but I think in many ways does frame, especially at the outset of this project, what we're going to be looking at. Because in many ways, the purpose of the harbor plan is to balance all the different needs, whether it relates to resilience, infrastructure, needs of the city, and then also economic development goals and how best to achieve those things. In many ways, I think a good lens through that is economic strategy as it relates to these other things. So right off the bat, that means existing conditions and needs, and then eventually we get into this, trends and opportunities, eventually benefits the community, ultimately resulting in the vision, goals, and implementation sections of the plan itself. That is, of course, colored by the second quadrant in this box, which is about the state regulatory environment. I already touched, oh, I'm so sorry. Tony, do you want to jump in real quickly?
Yeah, I have a question back on the previous slide.
Yes, absolutely.
Why is the Chapter 91 jurisdiction not delineated throughout the rest of the harbor? Because there are, it's marine industrial, not necessarily DPA in some of those areas, and that would be helpful to know.
That's an excellent question. I would say that is perhaps just we didn't get this, since we're right at the very initial start of the file, our extent of the exact land boundary in the city of Gloucester weren't so perfect that we could fill in the polygon all the way right off the bat. We're still actively redeveloping our base map. So to answer your question a little bit better, this is just our first diagram, but to your point about jurisdiction, it absolutely applies absolutely outside of the harbor area. The line is what the line is, but we need to still do a little bit of sort of analytical nuance to make sure we get the area that's in and out of the water for Chapter 91. So thank you very much. We'll make sure to sort of revise that as we keep going.
Thanks.
There is a very skinny line you'll see that shows the jurisdiction beyond the DPA areas.
The light red, yeah. And another thing which we need, just before I get any further, the light red is the historic high water line. So anything inland of that, or not inland, whatever, towards the water from that is within jurisdiction. We still have to do a couple other pieces. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, all right, I see it now.
The polygons are there within, to that note, there's a lot of different regulatory pieces that we need to be working on, right? Even within Chapter 91, there's the different kinds of tidelands. There's what is in or outside of the DPA. And then there's also just the role of the MHP versus the DPA process. And what is important for us to remember as we go through this is that in many ways, the point of this harbor plan is as a tool to add clarity and nuance to the broader goals of Chapter 91 and the needs of the city, right? And so the MHP is a chance to regularly revisit, and then revise based on the needs of the city, tweak things to try to better achieve the goals that, broadly speaking, Chapter 91, the DPA are there for. And so just right at the outset, it's important to remember we have three, major buckets of how this stuff can happen, right? There's amplifications and substitutes, and substitutions, which are pending approval from the state, the ability through a harbor planning process to propose variations on the overall principles, as long as they're consistent with the broader vision. Those are the major levers that we have at our disposal through the planning process to work through this stuff. Then, of course, there's also zoning amendments, which is that the city, through its own powers of zoning, can reshape what's going to be happening. And the point of the municipal harbor plan is to think through how these different levers can play the different roles that they have, come up with both a plan for that, seek approval from the necessary regulatory bodies, and then ideally, see these changes come to fruition. So that's sort of the broad framing of why we're here. The first steps that we have for us are to go back onto the 2014 Municipal Harbor Plan, right? There was a lot of goals there. There were a lot of changes, some of them more dramatic than other ones. And now that it's been, 6, 7-ish years, we need to revisit what did work, what's missing, and what maybe happened differently than expected back then. And so that is a first initial step of things that need to be fixed or amended from that plan. And then the sort of other big piece would be things that didn't even come up at the time, which are now salient. So to that point, that's where sort of the process of this master planning effort come into play, right? There is the need for public engagement to hear from everyone involved and all the major stakeholders. That then leads to thinking through goals and strategies. We then need to do our due diligence, and that's where the full set of sub-consultants comes into play to make sure that what we're doing is defensible and viable and in compliance with the different rules. And then, of course, that needs to get implemented so that it can, be ready for the next round of these kinds of revisions. So the reason why I'm saying all that stuff is that it affects the way we're thinking about the timeline, right? We're still in this initial kickoff phase of it, right? We've got the contract signed. We're officially working on this project, but before we can really get into all this other stuff, we need to have the harbor plans notice to proceed. In many ways, this is a regulatory step. It needs to be prepared. We need to work through it as a team in collaboration with the city. It needs to get published. There needs to be a comment period. And after that, CZM, the Coastal Zone Management Division, can say, yes, with all this information and the way you're thinking about the project, you can officially embark on this in a public-facing way. From there, we want to really develop the bulk of this plan in a period of what we're thinking is about 6 to 9 months. So now that's, 3-ish months after the notice to proceed is formally complete. So that's, a total of 9 to 12 months from right now. And the reason why, even though we're looking at a longer contract, why we want to work on the development of that plan in the shorter time frame is there's yet a whole other regulatory set of steps that we need to go through, right? The secretary needs to review it. There needs to be public comment periods, consultation periods, a decision, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's a little bit of complication because, as some of you may or may not know, there's been some at the state level statutory questions about the right way to have this thing happen. And harbor plans across the state are currently being sort of revised and reapproved to find a way that complies better with the law. That may or may not affect Gloucester, but the good news is we're not at that point right now. And so, that should very much be wrapped up, certainly by the time we need that information to be happening, which is a long way of saying we expect this entire project to take somewhere between 1.5 to 2 years, right? 16 to 24 months. But the heavy analytical and planning pieces, our goal is to have that wrapped up, within 9 to 12 months, and most of it taking a little bit longer than half a year. So I'm going to actually, I think, pass it back to, Skeena at this point. We now have sort of a diagrammatic way of looking through that. You can see how a lot of the planning work is fairly front-loaded, but then that regulatory piece and revisions to it drags out. Sorry, I shouldn't say drags out, takes a longer period of time to be seen through all the way.
Yeah, I'll take us quickly through sort of this more nuanced schedule and also speak to how we're planning to engage the public throughout the process. So as Will mentioned on the previous slide, we anticipate a 2-year timeline for this process, which appears long and lengthy, but is realistic, given that a lot of that time is Will has mentioned will be sort of back-end finalizing with CZM and also comment periods, including new steps in the process. That's if you see the last bullet in the schedule, amending Chapter 91 regulations to adopt new changes to the harbor planning process. And this we anticipate could take 3 to 4 months. And right now we're hoping that it could be concurrent with the schedule we've laid out here, but we'll still need to go back and confirm this. And we can speak more to specifics of this timeline in the discussion session later if anyone has specific questions. You'll see that the yellow, sort of the first part of the process, which is a good chunk of the summer going into the fall, will just really be focused on assessing baseline conditions and then developing preliminary economic goals and objectives and strategies. In tandem, we'll also start to evaluate the regulatory environment, identify inconsistencies, and review the current municipal harbor plan outcomes. At the bottom of the schedule, the little black circles, we're highlighting the larger public events that we're planning to hold. And right now we're aligning these with what we see as sort of major milestones in the project when we've developed an economic strategy, when we can start including the public in the visioning process, when we could have a draft plan laid out. So our first step this month in terms of engagement is really to begin the launching an engagement platform via creating a digital presence for this process. So we'll be launching a website that becomes sort of the repository of all that we are creating and achieving throughout this process. And then we'll be working towards our first public meeting, which is that first black circle there towards the fall. Once we have, once we've developed the sort of preliminary goals and strategies from the harbor planning process. So the first meeting will likely be digital, but as we go forward, we'll see if we can get a more physical public meeting happening. Next slide. So I'll just add that in addition to these larger public meetings, we're also placing careful attention in how we tailor an engagement plan for the municipal harbor planning process. And a lot of this was in our proposal as well as in our interview. So some of you may have already seen it, but we're thinking through various activities to keep the public both engaged and also educated on the harbor planning process. And collecting feedback through a variety of ways, including sort of crowdsourcing, surveys, interactive mapping platforms, social media, and then potential smaller stakeholder meetings and walking tours if possible. Next slide. And then in addition to the larger public meetings and more, we'll be holding a variety of specific stakeholder meetings, as well as city council meetings with city council boards and other governing bodies, and of course, meetings with all of you. So right now we've roughly laid out 9 to 10 meeting times for the Harbor Planning Committee, but this of course can become an ad hoc process as we continue going through the plan. And I think right now, like, we're all comfortable going forward with the Wednesday afternoon meeting time, but that could also change depending. I think I'll hand it over back to Matthew to just quickly take us through more background information and talk about the current harbor plan.
Yeah, just we're going to go into more. Some of you, I understand, participated in the last municipal harbor plan and are sort of fluent in these matters, and we will be spending some more time in the future talking in more detail about it. But we thought it was useful to quickly review where that plan got us and point out a few things that have happened since then. I think one of the most creative things that happened in the last plan was the kind of reallocation of what's called supporting uses. These are non-industrial uses in a DPA that are allowed by a certain percentage. In those orange areas, you'll see that in exchange for committing those areas to be 100% industrial, we were allowed to lower that percentage in the pink areas that you see, which are some of the DP areas inside of Chapter 91. We will be looking in more detail at some of the results of this, but this was one of the pretty important outcomes. We got pretty far in sort of customizing the legislation for Gloucester. It remains to be seen if this plan will produce anything quite as dramatic. If I have to guess, I'm going to say it's going to be more probably about refinement and tailoring rather than wholesale change, but I don't want to never say never. Next slide, please. One of the big and most obvious direct outcomes was the 2014 plan added marine research as an allowed use in Gloucester's DPA, and this is quite directly resulted in the feasibility of the Gloucester Marine Genomics Institute. And this is obviously but one piece that's happened since then, but I think looking to the future, the city is very interested in further blue economy, of diversifying water dependent uses beyond the traditional fishing economy into other areas that include research, and creating a sort of continuum, if you will, between heavy water uses and these more research related kinds of uses. So that will be a big part of that. If you recall the workflow, the big part of that sort of orange area will be looking at the viability of these kinds of uses with respect to the available land, the regulations, and what is likely to be supportable from an economic standpoint. But I think this is an important potential indicator of one avenue for a certain kind of economic development. Next slide, please. So I might sort of sum up here with some of our initial thoughts, particularly as they relate to this sort of first task of things that we think are going to be relevant for this study. One is about preservation versus change with respect to the economy. Is how do you balance the traditional fishing economy with what I just mentioned, these new sort of new blue economy and marine life sciences types of uses? What is the proper balance? What is desirable? What is good for the city? Adding resilience, flood protection and mitigation measures to this equation. This was much less on most people's radar, in 2014 and earlier, but it's really moved to the fore of the conversations. We've seen tangible results of sea level rise, and the degree of planning around sea level rise has become has really blossomed. And so this is one of the sort of ingredients that we're going to be adding to this plan that may play out with respect to the ultimate DPA municipal harbor plans or the economic strategy, or both. Physical development, one of the things that has limited some of the uses maybe, or one of the sort of relevant features, is the relative, what we call the shallow depth of the parcels between the waterfront and the nearest roadway. How does the size of the plots, their disposition, their depth, allow or not allow certain uses, and how do these permit us to consider other uses looking to the future? So the physical environment, the shape of the parcels, the plot ownership, these are all relevant factors. And then really maybe perhaps extremely important thing that we don't want to overlook is the relationship between harbor activity and upland and the rest of the city. What is the economic, the spatial, the relationship between harborfront activity that will be to some extent regulated through Chapter 91? What is the relationship between those activities and everything else that goes on in the city and its broader economic profile? These are not the only issues, but these are things that come to mind and might be sort of departure points for us to begin our sort of early stage analysis. Next slide. So our next steps really will be, again, this public kickoff, including a website presence that will provide information, some branding, preparing for initial workshops, and then we will begin a lot of our analytical work as well. So all that's going to proceed in the very near future. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Teskina, I believe we have time for some discussion or questions, and we might close on that map if that's helpful.
Yep,
Do you want me to pull it back up, or should I go back to this? I can go either way.
It's helpful to have a map up, but I think if I could just add one general comment, which is relative to other DPA and municipal harbor plans, this plan goes into greater than typical depth into some of this analysis of flood conditions and also the sort of economic development piece. And so while I think at the very end of the day, the definitive product we will have is an updated DPA master plan and a municipal harbor plan, I think along the way that this planning process and the research and the economic analysis will also produce other recommendations that might be implemented in other ways. So I think there's obviously the official regulatory outcome, but I think that there will be also other recommendations, alternative forms of implementation that are recommended as a result of this plan. Greg, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything or if it's a good time to maybe open up for more general conversation or questions.
Yeah, just quickly before we turn to the members of the committee, I also just wanted to point out, because I think after we had our first meeting of the committee after they were appointed by the mayor, we had some input from the public, concerned about timeline, who would be doing the work, when is there an opportunity for input. And that meeting that was held back in December was, again, very much just kind of a business meeting of the committee. And so as you had that slide that talks about, that there's going to be harbor plan committee meetings, there's going to be, when there's information points in the process that need to be vetted, not only by committee members, but the public, there's public engagement. And there's also going to be kind of a continuum of how people can interact. And I think what I hope to see out of this process from the engagement side is, I love the idea of having, the input that comes in on it also available for everyone to see. I think there are times when people might write a letter to the planning board, on a particular issue, or write a letter to the council, and they're not quite sure that they're being heard. It goes into, traditionally that would have gone into a hard file at the clerk's office or a hard file here. Are they seeing it? Are they listening? That type of a thing. And I think one of the benefits, because we always have to look for the silver lining in a pandemic, of how we've kind of pivoted and really tried to turn as much as we can that we do as a municipality available for the public to see. So most of our boards at this point have public facing folders that people can go in and see applications. When they submit a piece of information that they think is important to a process, it's available for everyone to see. So I'm really interested to see those opportunities for seeing all sides of the issue being available for everybody to see it. So we currently have a very bare bones presence for the harbor planning on our city website, and we'll be working with the group to really try to figure out the best ways that we can have that interaction be available for everyone. Because I just want to note that there are 8 attendees here that have a vested interest in this process. There'll be more as we publicize. But that when there is going to be a meeting that's going to be taking public comment, it will be placed on the agenda as either an opportunity for, again, we might use different methods for that. We may use a chat function on a Zoom meeting where somebody can enter their question, and maybe we do kind of a wrap up at the end of a meeting with some questions. Or we will also be setting up a specific email address for inquiries directed to this project particularly. So while some meetings will be, really more kind of a discussion amongst the committee, there should be this kind of continuum of opportunity for input. And just from the schedule that's been proposed, because we are kind of at some point we are at the mercy of the state process, which may take longer just because of the environment we're in, and also some of the issues that have been raised about approval, that there's going to be plenty of opportunity and time for people to have input on the process.
And not to belabor that point, but just as a quick follow-up from sort of the consultant side, this is, well, every city is unique, but there are some similarities between municipal and harbor planning processes in different places. And one of the big lessons that we've had over the past year has been to try, as planners, and find what seems like it works and seems like it doesn't work given this hybrid sort of setting. Tiskina briefly mentioned it, but didn't want to, blab about what we were going to be doing. But that whole idea of the website for the project, separate from the needs of the city website to sort of be the stalwart face of different city departments, for the purposes of the project, we fully intend that website for the project, that sort of temporary one that lives for the scope and duration of this project, be a useful and informative way to have that information, right? So listings of meetings, ideally even, whether it's notes or transcripts, video recordings of these meetings, and then also actually the engagement tools themselves, the combination of what we can ideally have be in person, but also ways of reaching out that are where the results are made available is, it seems, given the state of things, the best way to make the most out of the degree to which things have to be online. And so even as we go back to in-person versions of it, that sort of available record is something which we will be doing over the course of this project. So just to affirm what Greg is saying, basically, I just want to say that we agree.
Thank you, Will. Just a minor housekeeping issue for members. We have a pretty good sized group here, and I think it's helpful if there's a question that needs to be asked from a member, if you just raise your hand. I mean, it's helpful to keep microphones on mute, and you'll be recognized, and just keep people from talking over each other. So Greg, is there anything else that you want to mention before we get to some questions from members?
You can go to members, and the other thing that I hope that again, because we're in this environment, I think there's a huge benefit to how we've been capturing these processes and making them available to the public. I know there's been a fair bit of reporting in the paper, almost kind of retrospectively, but they can basically say that they were there and watched and listened to the meeting and report on things. I think it's also just, what would be helpful, I think, let's make it about me, is the education of people about, what it means to be in a DPA, what's allowed, what's not allowed. The amount of time over my 15 years with the city where I've had somebody walk in the door and say, what do you think about this? And it's not a matter of whether I think it's a great idea or not a great idea. It's what is possible, what's allowed. And so that is something that I carry with me every day and say, it sounds like a great idea for you. And in some setting, yeah, it sounds like a great idea, but it's just not something that's enabled in this location. So that's the way I approach everything. I don't overpromise and underdeliver and say, oh yeah, it sounds like a good idea. Give it a shot. So, reinforcing from the get-go, the purpose of the DPA, what its goals are, and that nexus of the alignment of the city's goals for the harbor as well, and just really broad education around it, just kind of is really helpful, because I don't think the general public really understands the complexity. And someone throws out an idea and all of a sudden people say, yeah, that would be great. And some things just aren't possible in the framework. So that's where, again, watching a video is great. The way that we can really bring people into the process that maybe have not followed prior harbor planning processes, for them to all kind of gain an understanding of the asset that we have, the importance of it, to the community is my personal goal.
Thank you, Greg. So at this point, I think if there's questions from members of the team, it'd be a good time to sort of start that exercise. And again, just if you don't mind raising your hand, and you can either do it electronically or otherwise. Who am I seeing?
Vito has his hand raised, I think.
Yep. Vito.
That's right. Just quickly, Vito Ciccone, happy to be a member of the Harbor Plan Committee. Property owner on the waterfront, but fisherman's advocate, fishing industry advocate. Coming from a perspective of, I think I want to really echo what Greg just said is so important. The education, and it's not limited to just the general public. It's property owners on the waterfront, and I think what really has to be exaggerated, I think, in your analysis of this, and I'm happy to hear that some of you have been involved in previous harbor plans, but I think what's somewhat unique about Gloucester is a vast majority of the DPA is private property. And I think that's different in a lot of the other municipalities. And from a planning perspective, I think that's a different angle. Because in order to make private properties viable, they don't have the same resources that the publicly owned properties would have. So I think that's an important aspect. And the education, I think, needs to go to all of us, property owners as well. Where does DPA fit? A lot of people think it's a unique piece of the of state legislation, when in reality it's a subset of Chapter 91. So I think that educational thing of showing, if there wasn't a DPA, these are the rules that you would have to follow with public access and all of those things. But when you overlay the DPA on it, it replaces some things. Very few people understand that approach, and then how the water dependent use zone works. I think because it's a privately owned waterfront for the most part, people would really benefit from getting that type of education right up front, so that the comments that come in are based in some reality. If you could provide that, I think right up front and early, that would be really helpful from my perspective anyway.
I think that's an excellent point. And yes, that's absolutely part of the plan. Is we spend a lot of the first meetings and the public outreach in that sort of education mode, as you say, because particularly in a DPA, there aren't a lot of levers we can push and pull, right? There's a limited menu of choices, so to speak, but there are important nuances to it. And so I'm glad you brought that up. That's an excellent point, particularly as it pertains to making the public engagement more productive and meaningful by having people respond to things in a realistic way. I can share at some other time. We did a public outreach poll in Salem around their DPA, and the questions are very carefully tailored in a way to solicit responses that weren't completely irrelevant, but really we're trying to work within the constraints.
Thank you, Matt. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Tony Grosh, Chairman of the Waterways Board. Vito, your point is really a good one for the city of Gloucester, with the, as you compare it to New Bedford, of course, is the one that we look, as that example where they have so much municipal property that they've been able to develop. And we've been hamstrung by that. That's a very important point. One of the things I hope that this harbor plan does address, there's a lot of talk about blue economy, which is sort of not theoretical, but the industries that will arrive are, somewhat unknown. But I would like to see this plan have some ideas and of how to increase our dependency on fish processing. They commonly hear there's so much fish being left in the water that we don't process. A lot of other ports are quite actively processing fish, and these smaller lots have actually been able to facilitate that. type of industry. So I think, you know, our best way to preserve fishing in Gloucester is to actually get some more processing. The way Vito's done it, Cape Ann Lobsterman, which was not here during 2014, they've, you know, really ramped up, you know, how do we get entrepreneurs back into our waterfront? I think really needs to be an emphasis that would help preserve our fishing and solve our some of our problems. Another issue is, are you going to target places like Americold that have completely tied up big chunks of waterfront? And, you know, is there Chapter 91 made them? I know they're in the DPA, but is there any addressing to that, that issue there on other properties too, that have, you know, certain Chapter 91 obligations that they're supposed to be fulfilling and are not? So, thank you.
I don't know if you want to take a stab at that, Matt.
Yeah, that will be part of the entire review. So I think that's part of what we would do in these first phases, is review how the previous legislation and the plan have been applied, and if there are any outstanding kind of obligations or pieces of it that don't work, that's part of the plan. That's why we do renewals, is to kind of repair those things. I am not yet completely fluent in the issues that you're specifically referring to, but I will say those are the kinds of things that we will be discussing and addressing sort of early on with Jamie's help.
I can very quickly just say that, you know, I know that in many ways Americold and that relationship with the waterfront for the last plan, in many ways that plan chose to solve other problems instead of that, right? Like that exact problem was not the target of the end result. And so it's definitely an issue. I don't know that we even as a group, or we haven't talked about that specifically at all yet with the city. And so I hesitate to say exactly how we'll address it, but I think we're at the point where you bringing it up, that's something worth thinking about, is totally appropriate. And we appreciate that.
Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks. An issue that I want to echo what Vito and Tony just said. I couldn't agree more on both. One of the elements that I think would be important to look at, Matt, on your slide, understanding and framing issues, which I thought was excellent. I think one of the big constraints is the private ownership of so much of the land around the harbor. But I think that there's reason to look at sort of organizational development and structure as well. And I say that from the EDIC hat that I'm wearing on this committee, which has traditionally been involved in successfully developing out our industrial parks, but is interested in understanding what its role in economic development, job creation, brownfields can be, and can be along the harbor. And, you know, other coastal cities have port authorities. Obviously, we do not. We have a small city planning department that I think has done an extraordinary job given its resources. But I think looking at, there's also the community development. What is it, Vince? What is that group that Lenny set up?
The Harbor CDC.
The Harbor CDC. Anyways, there are some institutional organizations, including the city, that I think it's important to at least understand what their charter is and or what their authority is and how they may fit into the economic strategies that we ultimately, you know, craft, such as, let's say, you know, fish processing or something along those lines. So I'd just like to make sure that the organizational entities are looked at and evaluated for the role that they may be able to do to get investment, get monies, advocate for strategies going forward.
I think that's an excellent recommendation. So yes, we can look in that. I will say that it's not totally unusual. The absence of publicly owned land is not totally unusual Chelsea Creek, well, I don't think we had any. And right now in Salem, there's only one property owner in the DPA, and it's not public. So it comes in different shapes and sizes. I'm struck by how many different property owners there are in the DPA. But I think to the extent that we can think about other organizations, or as you put it, organizational structures, to kind of bring some coherence or pressure or economies of scale to these things, I think that's a great idea.
Greg.
I don't have as the host, I don't think I have a raise hand button. So I want to just echo what Tom said. You know, I think the implementation strategies, the assignment of responsibility, and one of the specific questions that we had asked as we interviewed UTIL et al. Was to provide some examples of, you know, kind of metrics and measurement of success. You know, sometimes you have these efforts that go along. It doesn't have to be a harbor planning effort. It's got a lot of things that are outlined, not really well defined in terms of who's going to do them. And the assessment point is at the end of the planning horizon for that document. So I think, you know, it would be nice to have something a little bit more measurable, assigning of responsibility, and also, you know, almost like a continuous evaluation, or at least check-in points to measure the implementation, rather than just what you're doing for us, which we know some of the successes is that, you know, at the end of the process saying, okay, well, what did you say you were going to do? And let's see what you accomplished and what you didn't. You know, we don't have, you know, again, as Tom points out, we have different people that touch some of these aspects of it, including the Waterways Board, including the Planning Board, but there is no real entity. And I think that was actually one of the strategies or implementation strategies identified in the last, was to try to maybe have a more formalized body that might oversee. You know, and maybe the reason is resources, maybe the reason is it doesn't take that. But a little bit more clarity in identifying the roles could also be a benefit to everyone.
Thank you, Greg. Katie, did you have anything to add?
I guess one question I was wondering about, and maybe this is, if this is outside the scope, just let me know, Greg. I guess I'm asking how, when Matt kind of ended the presentation and he was talking about, he showed the map and he said that he really sees some additional benefit coming from this planning process beyond maybe the direct scope of work. I was wondering if that meant, as we're thinking about competing desired future uses, how does what we're talking about tie into a larger vision for Gloucester? And is that a part of this? I understand the scope of work for this group, but as we think about how the harbor is used, and is it great for one thing to, how does this tie into the larger vision of the community, or does it?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we had probably identified in maybe the background in the RFP is, you know, there may be things outside of the jurisdictional boundary of the DPA that may come out of this in terms of implementation strategy, whether it's relating to adjacent uses, traffic, pedestrian links, you know, all those. So it's a little bit, you know, the harbor planning area is a little bit more than just, you know, water side of Rogers Street, East Main Street, and Commercial Street. It's, you know, it's the interaction of what's happening in there as well as outside of the box. So, you know, those are the types of things that, you know, we also pointed to as we're kind of going through the, you know, the interview process of examples of, did you see something that, you know, was an issue within a harbor plan that led to something else outside of it? So, you know, it's not in isolation, it's the context. I mean, there are, you know, it's like the boundary between anything. You never really just say, we're just going to look on this side of it. So those are the types of things I could see that could be recommendations for, you know, interaction with the downtown, the immediate downtown area. I mean, East Gloucester is very different, and we have very, very little land area that's within the designated port area, but there's also the context of what's going on next to it, across the street, those types of things. And we definitely already see, push and pull between uses in a very tight area. So those are the types of things that I could see that would extend beyond just the kind of the DPA master plan part of this in terms of the context.
Yeah, and the only other thing I wanted to say was I support that point that Vito made at the outset. The fact that there's so many private landowners, and this is a really fantastic opportunity to look at so many intersecting issues, from economy to resiliency to planning all at once. No private landowner could pay for those assessments on their own. So it's such a great opportunity to look at this at a large landscape scale, and that education piece that goes along with it. So just agree with that point.
Thanks, Katie. Hal, did you have anything to add?
I think everyone pretty much hit all the issues. Tony made a great point about trying to get some processing in. I mean, most of the fish that's landed is being processed elsewhere. So, I mean, commercial fishing wise, that would be very beneficial to the city, and it would open up the city to more opportunities also.
Mm-hmm.
The potential we have in the city fishing wise is great. As Vito would know, we're sitting on a lot of potential fish once the science is straightened out. So getting designating areas for fish processing would be key to, the overall health of the fishing community.
Terrific. Thank you, Al. TJ, is there anything from your perspective at this point you'd like to add?
No, I really like to reiterate what Tony and Al just said pertaining to that. And I'd like to see maybe some expanded uses maybe, or really like to get into the numbers for the DPA regarding buildings that are vacant. I just really have a hard time seeing these vacant buildings that are continuing to dilapidate inside the DPA, especially Harbor Cove, and really no industry to inhabit them, or lots of restrictions in enabling people to not be able to use the property. So I would look forward to gathering ideas pertaining to that. It's just kind of a shame to keep seeing these buildings fall into disrepair with no use. So hopefully we can address those concerns, and maybe processing would be a great business or avenue to get these things back up and running.
Thanks, TJ. Chris, is there something that you'd like to add from the administration side? Mr. Carranza? He may be away from his phone. Tony?
Yeah, I just had, it was funny when Tom brought up the EDIC. Are we considering the DPA an industrial park? That's all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we have an answer for that just yet.
Go ahead, Tom.
Well, we're not considering an industrial park, but looking at the legislative mandate, it's not necessarily, an EDIC is not necessarily limited to its work on industrial parks. And in fact, EDIC in Boston, South Boston, that Jamie has a lot of experience with, I know, as well as Lynn, the EDIC has certainly been an active player because it owns these properties or has been involved in the administration of those properties. So, but we're not necessarily thinking of them as an industrial park, but wondering whether there's a role that we can play.
Very good. Jamie?
Mr. Chairman, I'm really intrigued by the comments and questions here today. I'm really interested in the focus that this group has on economic development, surrounding the harbor. And I have the burden of having been around long enough to remember why DPAs were created in the first place. I was in my first job out of college, I actually worked for the Coastal Zone Management Program, and in the late 1970s, and that's actually where the DPAs came from. And I apologize if the lawnmower's going in the background, but the crew just arrived. So part of what the Coastal Zone Management Program did, it was a great program. It was a fantastic job for me. I learned a ton of stuff. But one of the things they wanted to do was to establish, areas that were highly sensitive from an environmental standpoint, and give those highest level of protection, but also recognize that part of our waterfront is really industrial, heavily industrial, and that's important too, and it needs a little bit of a different treatment. And they wanted to capitalize on the public investments in highways and bridges and rail and dredging and all that stuff that made these areas suitable for industry. And so they created designated port areas. And at that time, Chapter 91 only applied in the water. It didn't apply on land at all. So at that time, the designated port area had no land use implications whatsoever. In fact, all it really did was it made it easier for you to dredge and fill and build piers and wharves and do those kind of things that they wouldn't really want you doing in other parts of the coast, but they softened the rules a little bit. And so the primary benefit of the designated port area was as a kind of economic development district. And the way the program was set up, that designation would give you priority for state and federal funding. And so its real essence, its real origin was exactly what you guys are talking about as an economic development area. And I just tell you as an aside, for those of you who may know, the city of Lynn, sorry about this, the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Massachusetts, at the time the CZM program was being developed, was Tommy McGee. Not the Tommy McGee who's now the mayor of Lynn, but his father. And since he was the speaker, he saw this CZM program and he said, economic development, state and federal grants, I want that. So he essentially forced the CZM program to designate almost the entire city of Lynn as a designated port area, even though it didn't actually qualify, but he was the speaker, so what are you going to do? So most of Lynn got put in a designated port area, and they did take advantage of it. They got a lot of state and federal funding, but then in 1983, when the legislature passed the Public Waterfront Act, which captured the fill tide lands, right, and led to the rules that we understand them today, that affect land use in the designated port area. So that was a whole different ballgame, but nobody ever said, given those rules, do we have the right areas designated? These DPAs were designated in 1978. They weren't designated in 1990 when those new rules came into effect. So there's always been a little bit of a conflict around that issue. But I just thought, given your thoughts and your comments, it's kind of interesting to reflect back on the origins of the DPA, and it was definitely to promote economic development. And Tom, as you mentioned, the EDIC has been around a long time in Gloucester, done a lot of economic development. The waterfront, I mean, it's not like Gloucester's done nothing, but the waterfront urban renewal project was important. And that was the genesis of a lot of what you see on the waterfront today. It was creating Rogers Street and widening it, straightening it. And that was sort of behind the whole expansion of Gorton's and Americold, and took a while, but it also led to the head of the harbor area. So it was, that was an entity, public entity that played a important role in the waterfront as well. And no reason you couldn't do that today. again, I apologize for the back.
Thank you, Jamie. If you don't mind hitting your mute button, that would be helpful. Thank you. I guess, thank you for touching on that, Jamie. I think the thing that I'm interested in exploring this time around, I think this is my third harbor planning committee. And I think an understanding of the goals of the designated port and CZM and, is Gloucester living up to those goals and benefiting from, the participation in, the designated port scheme, meaning that you have this access to, grant monies. We're not a bustling waterfront like we were, in the 70s and the 80s. To understand what that mission statement is from the DPA and the overseers of it. And if the answer is yes, then, and here's the reasons why we believe it is yes, then terrific. If the answer is maybe not so much, what are areas that, again, with substitution and amplifications, where are areas that we can push to, sort of get caught up. And Matt or Greg, I think the other question I had is on boundary review. Is it an every 10-year window to do a boundary review, Greg, or is it a 5-year?
So there's a couple of conditions. There's one that relates to whether a property's been used for a marine industrial use. It has to have not had and attempted to market for a 5-year period before it can be considered. When you do a holistic boundary review, I want to say that's a longer time frame. And again, it's not likely that, after going through the comprehensive review of, what was included or not, we've kind of already gone through the characterization of either, what the actual water depth is, whether it has the capacity to really be a contributor to the designated port area, and that kind of concluded before the last harbor plan. I'm also noticing that there's a attendee, Catherine Glenn, is here if you want a more specific answer to that question.
Would you like to make a comment, Catherine? I don't see her.
Can you hear me now? I am here.
Oh, there you are. Thank you.
Okay, great. Actually, is it unmuted? Just told me I was muted again. Am I muted?
No, you're here.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, I just wanted to weigh in on that, Rick, because I want to make sure that it's clear that the DPA boundary review is completely separate from the municipal harbor planning process. I think you already know that. Last time we did do it before we did the municipal harbor plan, but it's not something that automatically happens. It can be requested. It's not done parcel by parcel. If you remember last time, it's done area by area. So it's not really a, we can look at this parcel, we can look at that parcel, we look at areas. So, but it does matter whether the area is within, if it's already in water dependent industrial use, the presumption is that it functions for water dependent industrial use. So we don't have to look to see whether it, should be in the DPA, because if it's functioning with water dependent industrial use, then it does. So that's kind of a really quick and dirty way to get at that. And I can definitely provide more information on that if needed.
Terrific. Thank you, Catherine. Are there any sort of follow-up comments from the consulting side of things, sort of responding to the comments from members? I think it's been a productive time, and I think it's a good stepping off point. But I'd like to give the consulting team an opportunity if there is any other sort of follow-up questions.
I had nothing to add. It's been very helpful to understand what your priorities are. Again, we're not heavy into the content yet. This is sort of introductory and administrative in nature, but very good to get a preview of what some of your concerns are, and great to see that there's a lot of experience with the past plans on this committee. So I have nothing specific to add unless anyone else does.
Okay. Greg, do you want to talk about?
Rick, I'm just noting that I don't know if Catherine re-raised her hand.
I did.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure, because we haven't really talked about it. It was mentioned at the beginning, but you know, the CZM is going to be, you know, we're going to play a major role in the harbor planning process. We need to be at the table and talking with you on a regular basis. Our view of harbor planning comes from the Secretary's approval criteria standards sort of approach to what that final plan that is submitted to her will need to look like. So we definitely want to be, you know, going along as you're developing the plan to make sure that you know, it's going towards that path. And you know, the other thing I just wanted to highlight as I looked at the schedule is making sure that, you know, if you're at the point that you're going to start thinking about the request for the notice to proceed, that you work with us and don't, you know, rather than doing it and then coming to us and submitting it, it'd be really great to work, you know, right with us on getting that ready, because that's really the scope of work from the Secretary's point of view. So I want to make sure that whatever's in there is reflected and that you have plenty of time to work that in. So we are available for technical assistance at any time. So I just want to make sure that that's front and center and we don't forget about that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you for that. And Catherine, maybe just a minute or two on the CZM effort that's going on currently, just for the benefit of the members, just to understand a little bit about the scope and how that sort of is a parallel discussion as we get started on our 16-month journey.
Sure, thank you. So we were able to get some funding to do a sort of a pilot project where we're looking at both Gloucester and Chelsea to think about, you know, the different resiliency needs of a designated port area. People who are working need to be doing sort of industrial work right on the waterfront when it comes to things like being resilient to storms, being able to, you know, stop work while the storm occurs and they get right back to work again. It's a little different than some other areas where people might be able to build up and away from the water and so forth. So we wanted to be able to look at very specific types of industrial waterfronts and how, you know, what types of approaches might be best used in those locations to try to build resiliency for waterfront operations, particularly in designated port areas, but any working waterfront. So we've done some work. We've talked to some folks within Gloucester Harbor and also in Chelsea, and we are in the midst of putting together some sort of best management practices, and there'll be a report that comes out of that to kind of talk about it. It's very, you know, it's kind of relatively high level. It's not very specific.
We just dropped out, Catherine. We might have lost her for a moment. Tony, did you have a quick question?
Yeah, I was wondering, can the committee get these slides?
Yeah, so I will be, you know, we'll be creating probably something similar that we have for other boards, committees, and commissions of kind of a publicly available folder through the Harbor Plan Committee webpage, where all the anything that's presented here will be available for anybody to download there. You already have access to a Harbor Plan Committee drive. Well, you know, so we'll be doing a little bit of duplication of making things available. So you'll have one that you can always go to. But again, if you ever want to refer back to anything, we'll also have one that you can go right to the city website, click on to see. But we do have this presentation available, and we can make sure that all the members have it available as well.
Greg, one quick question. I don't know if we completely lost Catherine, but do you know the timeline for the CZM study? And I guess a question would be, our understanding, and I think it maybe is to the nature of the pilot that they're doing for DPAs, but do you have, our understanding is that a lot of that focus is probably more building specific in the DPA, and it may be their scope, and it may not address other considerations where there could be pathways, flood pathways along the water that could impact other areas of the city that would be of interest more specific to Gloucester, but it may not be something that they're as interested in because it may not be as replicable. But if they're looking at some of the DPA specific items, but do you have more information?
So it looks like she's back, but I can tell you, I think the timeline of the completion of that is by June 30, but I'll let Catherine speak more specifically to that question.
Yes, so this project is a capital funding. It needs to be done by June 30th. We do have specific mapping for Gloucester Inner Harbor that we have for this project. So that can help with some of those pathways that you're talking about, Jason. So, you know, and that will be made available, and all the other information will be made available by the end of the, they should have all of the work done by June. We should be able to have it out by July and available. And we definitely will be circling back with the city to present that information.
Great, thank you.
Very good, appropriate to talk about next steps.
Yeah, I guess, Matt, do you think it makes sense to try to nail down the next meeting date, or are we a little bit more? And I think the next Harbor Plan Committee meeting was going to be scheduled for, was it July? Was it going to be 1 month off of June, or did you want to meet more intermittently than that? Or near term, I should say.
Teskina and I just discussed this. Teskina, if you can refresh my memory, I think it was July.
Yeah, I think it was July, and try to sort of get our sub-consultants, our economic and resiliency team members to weigh in on the process before we start to get it going with the next meeting.
I think the idea is that we will have embarked on a lot of our analysis and research, and we'll have a lot more substantive sort of things to discuss with the committee at that point.
Okay. So do we want to earmark a date?
Sure.
I'm looking at July. So I'm assuming there might be some travel. 4th of July falls on a Sunday. So maybe if we push to that second week, which would be Wednesday the 14th, does that seem like reasonable for folks?
Sure.
Okay. So we'll say July 14th.
And then will that be the same afternoon time?
So I guess I'd ask folks what they feel about start times. We've used 2 o'clock, we've used 3 o'clock. Does earlier work better, later afternoon better for folks? We can stick with the 3 o'clock.
So I guess my only concern is that, I mean, if we're going to stick to a fairly strict timeline, I mean, these Zoom meetings, in my experience on the planning board, can go for hours because people are comfortable at home and they can stretch their legs. And so I'm content at 3 o'clock if people feel as though they need more time. A 2 o'clock time frame would suit me as well. But I think it's important to, to establish a timeline that, and everybody's busy. We've got a lot of people involved in this exercise, so I want to make sure that we start and finish at an appropriate time and people can keep schedules. So that's my only input. Okay. Any other business, Greg?
Nope. So did we say 2 or 3?
So why don't we say 2?
Everybody give me a thumbs up if they say 2 o'clock. There's 1, 2.
Motion carries.
There's a lot. Katie did not even flinch.
I like 3, but I'm happy to do 2.
Very good.
Okay, well, we'll go with 2 because we might, have more meaty agendas, and then maybe that we won't spill into dinner time and that type of thing. So we'll go with 2 o'clock on the 14th.
Thank you.
And if that is all, then somebody can make an motion to adjourn.
Tony?
So moved.
And a second.
Seconded.
Okay, and I'll just do a quick roll call. Member Noonan?
Yes.
Member Balf?
Yes.
Member Gigaloni?
Yes.
Member Gross?
Yes.
Member Call?
Yes.
Okay. Get outside. It's still kind of looking bright. Thank you all. We'll be in touch.
Everybody, bye-bye.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Have a great
Bye.
day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all. Bye.